On the 19th of September 2021, Derbyshire Police in the UK received the following horrific 999 call.
Basically, I need the police and the ambulance and that because I've killed 4 people.
Okay, just hold the line. Bear with me.
This was no joke. The man making this call, Damien Bendall, had in fact killed 4 people, including his pregnant partner, her 2 children, and another child who was at the property for a sleepover. He also raped one of the children while they lay dying. This crime shocked the nation and led to a review which revealed serious failings in the management of this man's case by people who should have been protecting the public. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Damien Bendall was born on the 6th of January 1990 and raised in the town of Swindon in Wiltshire. I don't have much information about his upbringing, but it appears he grew up in a dysfunctional family surrounded by domestic abuse, drugs and general criminality. Bendall would wear his family's reputation with pride, with him often boasting about how often his family members had been in jail, and he was described by people in the local area as someone who thought he was a, quote, bad boy and, quote, wannabe gangster who was desperate to emulate his family members, who he idolised. He engaged in a campaign of antisocial behaviour in his local area, terrorising neighbours and shop owners, as well as committing petty crimes such as shoplifting. A massive red flag was the fact that Bendall was known in the area as someone who enjoyed torturing animals, and he would boast about killing kittens and dogs by beating them to death with bricks. Clearly, from a young age, Bendall was an individual who believed he could do and take whatever he wanted without consequence, an individual who enjoyed violence and inflicting pain on others, someone who was willing to violently kill living creatures. He was also a racist and would racially abuse and target Asian members of the community. He claimed to have been a high-ranking member of the Aryan Brotherhood, but, whilst was undoubtedly a white supremacist, his affiliation to any right-wing organisation has never been proven. Throughout most of his life, Bendall was addicted to drugs, specifically cocaine and heroin, and he began using these when he was a teenager, and began committing offences to get money to fund his habit. On the 20th of April 2010, he was stopped by the police who searched him and found cocaine on him, so he was given another caution. However, within 6 weeks, he committed his first serious offence, which he was caught for. On the 3rd of June 2010, Bendall attacked an Asian man walking alone in the street, and, when this individual resisted, he beat him before robbing him of his belongings. The beating this man received was far in excess of what was necessary to commit the offence. It was clear that Bendall was getting off on the use of extreme violence. Before the victim lost consciousness, he remembered Bendall racially abusing him while he punched him again and again and again. Bendall was soon caught and, on the 30th of June 2011, was sent to prison for 3 years for robbery. Bendall had interactions with various professionals in prison, one of whom described him as, quote, cold and calculated and quite psychopathic. He was assessed to be highly manipulative and a man fully in control of his emotions who was willing to use extreme violence in order to get his own way. Bendall was released in August 2012 and seems to have stayed off the police's radar for a few years, but this obviously doesn't mean he wasn't committing crimes. During this time period, it's known now that he was violently abusing a woman who was terrified of him. Not much information is available about this woman, but I shall call her B. It's not clear what behaviour B was subjected to, but, as I've tried to reinforce time and time again, the violence that people are willing to use behind closed doors towards people they supposedly love is often far worse than what they use towards others. So, considering this is a man who apparently enjoyed killing animals, I can only imagine the horror this woman was subjected to, and fully understand why she felt unable to report this to the authorities until later, as he would have probably killed her had he found out. Bendall could not stay out of trouble for long, and on the 7th of June 2015, he walked into a newsagent's in Swindon, run by Narendra Patel, who was 62 years old at the time. Mr. Patel later recalled, quote, he was pacing up and down the shop, looking out the window. I was suspicious as soon as he came in. I kept a close eye on him. I remember he phoned someone and was still staring out the window before he finished the call and moved over to the fridge. He was lurking there for a while before deciding to buy some cold drinks. I put them into a bag for him and then he went back to the window and made a second call. After finishing that second call, he came back to the counter and pulled up his sleeve and showed me a knife with a blade of about 7 inches. He said, "Give me your money and cigarettes," but I instinctively reached for the golf club I keep by the counter for protection. I grabbed it and tried to hit him over the head with it as he lunged towards me, but he ducked down just in time. I then ran around the counter and chased him out of the shop like the coward he is. He ran off. He was far too quick for me. A manhunt was started, but, likely feeling the heat and knowing he would be caught, Bendall handed himself in to the police. On the 21st of August 2015, he was again sent to prison for 3 years, this time for attempted robbery and possession of a knife. Bendall's violent behaviour was escalating significantly, and in early 2016 he was refused to transfer to another prison. He then spent the next few months plotting his revenge, and on the 10th of May 2016 he attacked a prison officer, beating them so severely they were knocked unconscious and subsequently had to have surgery for their injuries and months of rehabilitation to regain full mobility. 2 other officers were also assaulted when they stepped in to try and save their colleague. Whilst Bendall was in prison, B had reached out to the probation service to warn them how dangerous he was and that she'd been victimised by him. She was clearly terrified that he would come back after her. These concerns would have been heightened when on the 31st of October 2018, Bendall was released from prison on licence, but he only lasted a matter of weeks before being recalled to prison for drinking to excess and not complying with the terms of his release. He was sent back to prison on the 28th of November 2018 and remained there for the rest of his sentence before being eventually released on the 9th of August 2019. Soon after this release, concerns were reported about risks towards young girls. So on top of everything, being a violent thug, a bully, a racist and a domestic abuse perpetrator, Damien Bendall was also a paedophile. In May 2020, Wiltshire Police were receiving reports about him grooming a vulnerable 16-year-old girl who was in care, but also him trying to start sexual relationships with younger girls who were in the same position. No doubt Bendall saw these girls as easy prey, to use them to get his sexual needs met, but also he likely believed he could easily control them. The police were so concerned that they assessed Bendall as posing a high risk of serious harm to children, i.e. they believed he was already or was about to offend against female children. This information was shared with the probation service, but, as will be highlighted later, ignored when it really mattered. The real danger of psychopaths like Damien Bendall is their ability to charm and manipulate, their ability to portray a superficial charm that draws others in. Whilst Bendall was a violent psychopathic criminal, when it came to women, he would initially present himself as a gentleman, drawing them into his web, and then he would show them the monster he really was, but by this point, it was too late. They were under his control, too terrified to leave. This is how he convinced 35-year-old Terry Harris to begin a relationship with him after the pair met on a dating website in March 2020. Terry had recently broken up with her partner of 14 years, Jason Bennett, who was the father of her 2 children, Lacey, aged 11, and John Paul, aged 13. Terry was smitten with Bendall, and, within a few months, he'd moved to Sheffield in South Yorkshire to be with her. This move served 2 purposes. It meant that he could more easily control Terry by being closer to her, but also he could avoid the police, as he was a wanted man. This was due to him setting fire to a car in Swindon on the 9th of May 2020, whilst drunk and high on cannabis. Whilst Terry was completely taken with Bendall, her friends and family were extremely concerned. Like when he was a child, Bendall had to be the big man and would brag about his criminal past and that he was on the run from the police. Bendall was a leech. He didn't work and instead spent what little money he had on alcohol and drugs. Terry paid for everything, and she was essentially living with 3 children. Terry's mother, Angie Smith, was sure that her daughter was being coercively controlled. She saw that Terry always seemed to be walking on eggshells around Bendall, possibly fearful that if she said the wrong thing he would kick off. He was also stopping her from seeing her mum and made her cut contact with her friends. Angie begged her daughter to leave Bendall, but she was in love with him, and the pair quickly began living together in a property in Killermarsh, a village just outside Sheffield. Terry became pregnant early in the relationship and was ecstatic, However, Bendall twisted this happy occasion into fueling his paranoia that she'd been cheating on him with another man, and neighbours heard him interrogating her about this. As I've mentioned in many of my videos, sexual jealousy is an extremely worrying sign in a relationship, and often shows the extremely paranoid and irrational behaviour of a perpetrator, with them being convinced their partner will cheat on them and leave them without any evidence, so they'll control them in order to make sure this doesn't happen. With a roof over his head and money in his pocket, Bendall could indulge his addictions to drink and drugs, and, when he ran out of money, he would sell items in the house. Everything was about Bendall's needs and wants, and he expected others to cater to them while he sat around high and pissed, contributing nothing to the house or society, which was basically a template for his whole life. In May 2021, the police finally caught up with Bendall, and he was arrested for the arson in Wiltshire the year before and was taken to court. Unfortunately, it's at this point that the inexplicable mistakes were made, which likely contributed to the horror which occurred just a few months later. In both the US and the UK, and likely courts across the world, it's common for a report to be prepared by probation to assist in sentencing. In America, I believe this is called a pre-sentence investigation. In the UK, it's simply called a pre-sentence report. In the UK, this document basically contains the probation officer's analysis of the offence itself, but in a wider context is to assess the risk of the individual by taking into account various factors, including previous criminal history, level of remorse, motivation to change, etc. This document should be a thorough breakdown of the individual, taking information from various sources, for example police intelligence, and giving the court an indication of whether this person is safe to be in the community and could be supervised by probation, or whether they need to be sent to prison to protect the public. Unfortunately, the probation officer who wrote the report did not do their job. They appear to have based their observations and conclusions solely on what Bendall said, a charming but dangerous psychopath. He made statements about wanting to change and how, this time, he would comply with the rules. The officer made no inquiries with anyone or checked his long criminal history. If they had, they would have seen his history of violent behaviour both in and out of prison, warning flags everywhere about his behaviour towards partners, and concerns about his risk towards children. Due to this lack of diligence, they told the court that in their assessment, Damien Bendall posed a low risk of serious harm to partners and to children, i.e. no risk at all. They also recommended that Bendall not go to prison and instead be subject to a curfew at the property he was living in with Terry Harris, so basically he needed to wear an ankle bracelet, which meant that he could not leave the house between certain hours, usually overnight, and this is seen as a punishment as it restricts a person's liberty. I'm not sure what the thinking is in America, but in the UK, curfewing a domestic abuse perpetrator to an address with a partner, let alone a pregnant partner, is potentially extremely dangerous. It basically means that a perpetrator is forced to be in the property with their victim for as long as the curfew is in place. Being in the home for more time often leads to more conflict and increases the chance of an incident occurring. In addition, checks should have been done with the homeowner to see whether they wanted the person there. Terry was not contacted and asked her opinion. We will never know what would have happened had the report been different. The judge may have still decided not to send Bendall to prison, but the information presented to them was so off the mark as to be negligent. So, on the 9th of June 2021, Damien Bendall was sentenced to a suspended prison sentence and a curfew, and he went back to the property with Terry and the children. Only 3 months later, their address would be the site of a horrific act of pure evil. In the late evening of the 18th of September 2021, Damien Bendall was in the property with Terry Harris and her 2 children, John Paul aged 13 and Lacey aged 11, who were getting ready for bed. Tragically, a 3rd child was also present, who had come round for a sleepover, Lacey's best friend, 11-year-old Connie Gent. Bendall claimed later he'd been on a 3-day cocaine binge by this point. What happened next will never be known for sure, but Bendall took a claw hammer and attacked all 4 of the people in the house. Each of the 4 victims died in different rooms, suggesting that as soon as the attacks began, everyone ran for their lives. He then went room to room, searching for his victims, and he then repeatedly struck them in the head with the hammer. The attacks were so vicious that their skulls were described as being, quote, smashed in with the force of the attack. The whole house was covered in blood. What Bendall did next is almost beyond belief, but after beating 11-year-old Lacey almost to death, he took her into the bedroom with the body of her dead or dying pregnant mother and raped her. The pathologist stated that Lacey was raped after she'd been attacked and while she was dying from the horrific head injuries inflicted on her by Bendall. When he had finished, Bendall sat with the bodies for several hours. He made no attempts to clean up the house. He was then caught on CCTV carrying a bag which contained John Paul's Xbox. He then took a taxi and exchanged this games console for drugs. Footage was also caught of him going into a corner shop. No sign of distress or concern. Remember, this is a man who had just murdered 4 people whose bodies were lying where he'd left them. It was at this point, around 12 hours after the murders, when Bendall made the 999 call I played at the beginning of the video, confessing to murdering 4 people. This is the police body cam footage of the officers who arrived at the scene.
Yeah, I don't know what happened.
Alright, come to me. Mate, have you got anything on you that you shouldn't have?
No, there's no weapons or nothing.
Right.
Do you just want to undo your coat? Have you armed yourself?
Yeah.
You have?
Have you stabbed yourself, mate?
I can see blood on your hands.
Yeah.
Anywhere else?
Just my chest, 4 inches in with a bread knife.
Can we have a look?
Yeah, and one on the stomach. I bled quite.
Right, do you want to
take
yes.
Can we go down
No, just stay there.
I just don't want to be in front of everyone.
Alright, just go on the corner.
Just walking wounded at the minute.
Alright, stand here. Stay here.
Right,
So,
we're told, I know what's going to happen to you now, mate.
Well, I know it's going to happen
We just-
when we go to prison, obviously, but again.
Why, what have you done? Have you done something to anyone else?
Yeah,
What have you done?
I've murdered 4 people.
He's been calm and compliant, but he's got some stab wounds to his chest. They're not oozing blood, but he's saying that his family are inside and that he believes he has murdered them.
do you want to go?
Are you alright for me to go in? Damien, it's 07:47 hours. I'm arresting you on suspicion of murder. You don't have to say anything, but it may harm your defence. Do not mention when questioned something later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Your arrest is necessary to protect you from harm, to prevent your disappearance, for a prompt and effective investigation. Okay? We're going to get you up, we're going to put you in the back of the van. Stand up.
I want to raise a couple of things. Firstly, him stating, almost with an air of contempt, that he's going back to prison again, as though this is somehow unreasonable. Also, his half-baked attempt to end his own life. No doubt everything about this situation was about control. He called the police so he could control the narrative. He harmed himself to make himself look like a man who was so horrified by what he'd done that he tried to end his own life. This was ignoring the fact that it would later be easily proved that he was so distressed that he didn't call the police or an ambulance and instead went out to score drugs by selling the possessions of a child he'd just murdered. Bendall was all ready with his defence, telling the officers, quote, "The whole house is covered in claret. I used a hammer. I didn't realise what I'd done." He also reinforced them that he'd been on a drug bender for the last few days and was so high he couldn't remember a thing. However, this callous, evil monster couldn't help but brag about his crimes, saying to the officers, quote, "I bet you don't get 4 murders in Killamarsh, do you?" As though the police should somehow be excited they were in the presence of a celebrity, and should be somehow in awe of the coward who ended the lives of children. There was no dispute about who had committed the offences, and Damien Bendall was charged with 4 counts of murder, as well as 1 count of rape, and was remanded into custody to await his fate. Damien Bendall tried every tactic in the book in court. He claimed that he was so high he'd suffer from amnesia when the killings occurred. He also initially flatly refused to admit raping 11-year-old Lacey, inevitably due to knowing the treatment child sex offenders get in prison. Bendall offered to plead guilty to manslaughter, basically acknowledging that he killed all 4 victims, but denying that it was premeditated. This was rejected. It was easy to disprove Bendall's lies, including the fact that his amnesia around the killings was so profound, yet he had the gumption to bag up the games console, make his way into town, and score drugs. Also, he'd waited hours to call for help, and, when police did arrive, he was cold, detached, and acting like a man who'd stolen a bag of sweets and not ended the lives of 4 people. On December the 21st, 2021, at Derby Crown Court, knowing the writing was on the wall, Damien Bendall pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder and 1 count of rape. That same afternoon, he stood before Mr. Justice Sweeney KC to be sentenced. As a last-ditch attempt to gain sympathy, through his barrister, Bendall claimed that he was now remorseful for his actions. The judge was having none of it. In his sentencing remarks, the judge stated the murders were, quote, brutal, vicious and cruel, and they were committed against defenceless children and a woman he claimed to have loved, who was in the early stages of pregnancy, carrying his child. He then sentenced him for the murder and rape of 11-year-old Lacey Bennett, as well as the murders of 13-year-old John Paul Bennett, 11-year-old Connie Gent, and 35-year-old Terry Harris. Damien Bendall was sentenced to a whole life order, meaning that he will never be released from prison. The agony the families of the victims suffered is beyond description. Angie Smith, Terry's mother, spoke about the utter devastation from losing not only her daughter, her only child, but also her grandchildren. She said, quote, "Since then, my life has been one purely of existence. I will try and put across some of my feelings and how much of a void this senseless crime has had on my life. Some days, I question the meaning of existence. He has taken everything from me, and I wish he had taken my life, not theirs. I struggle to explain to my elderly parents what happened. I don't know myself, but I must accept I may never know, as the only person who knows is Bendall. Terry was my only child. I'll never have any other children, or grandchildren. They were the most precious things in my life. I would give anything to be able to spend a moment with them." She also spoke about sitting in the mortuary, between the bodies of her murdered family, in total disbelief to the horror she was experiencing. The injuries Damien Bendall inflicted were so horrific, I cannot even imagine what her last image of her daughter and grandchildren must have been. Jason Bennett, John Paul and Lacey's father, released a statement which said, quote, "The murder of my 2 children has destroyed and taken my life away. Life now seems pointless. Looking forward to the future is painful and difficult. If it wasn't for my partner, I wouldn't be here now. Occasionally, I do become distracted by what has happened. My mind goes back to the trauma of how they died. I have a story in my head of how they died and relive the trauma. John and Lacey were innocent. So many family and friends have been traumatised. I won't see them grow up or be given the opportunity to be a granddad. I'm angry their life, their future has been taken. I'm lost without them. I need them." Just 9 days after his little girl was murdered, Charlie Gent, father of little Connie, agreed to be interviewed as he wanted to share an important message which I think needs to be shared with all of you.
Connie had the ability to always make me smile. She was like my best friend. There are no words. I'm gonna miss my baby girl.
It is just 9 days since Charlie Gent was told his 11-year-old daughter Connie was one of 4 people who'd been killed during a sleepover at her best friend's house.
Connie was one of the nicest girls you'll ever meet, I suppose. She was special. She could have been anything she wanted to be. I'd rather it be me than her. She got a whole life out of it.
Charlie had been told just a few hours after Connie's body was discovered at the house in Killarmarsh in Derbyshire last week.
Since I found out, it doesn't even feel real. I wake up every morning and hope. Yeah, it's all been a bad nightmare, but yeah, it hasn't.
Connie's best friend Lacey Bennett was also killed that night. They'd spent their last day setting up a sweet stall to raise money for charity. They would often sleep over together, not something her father ever worried about.
The last thing you think of, innit, when, like, your daughter's sleeping out, they're having a good time, aren't they? Not a million ways round. You could try and change it or change the events leading up to it. Place blame everywhere you want, but I don't know. It'll eat you alive, I think, in the end, won't it?
Charlie says he wants people to know about the fun times he had with the daughter he's lost, and wanted to be interviewed to urge parents to value their time with their kids. He never knew his most recent day with Connie would be their last.
Anything you remember about that day?
Yeah, just how good she felt to hold. And how safe she made me feel.
He says he can now only treasure the memory of every day they spent together.
In January 2023, His Majesty's Inspectorate of Probation published the findings of their review of the case of Damien Bendall to determine why this horrific incident occurred. It's a scathing document and lays the blame squarely on the shoulders of probation, and in particular, the appalling report written by one probation officer for Bendall's sentencing for arson just a few months before the murders. The report reinforces the need for comprehensive checks to be undertaken at court stage so that reports are accurate, give the judge an accurate idea of the risk that a person poses so they can sentence them appropriately. The probation officer in question was apparently fired as a result of their negligence. However, nothing in this report, or any kind words or statements of remorse, can undo the horror in this case. Hopefully learning will be taken from this report, but it's far too little, far too late. I want to reiterate support services for those experiencing domestic abuse, given that this is a horrific example of the seriousness of this type of offending. Within approximately 18 months of first meeting Terry Harris, Damien Bendall had murdered her and both of her children. I want to add a few more numbers for support more regionally in the UK, so if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice and support in England, you can call Refuge's National Domestic Abuse Helpline on 0808 2000 24/7. In Northern Ireland, call the Domestic and Sexual Abuse Helpline on 0808 802 1414. In Scotland, call the Domestic Abuse and Forced Marriage Helpline on 0800 027 1234. And in Wales, call Live Fear Free on 0808 80 10 800. If you're in the US, call the National Domestic Violence Hotline on 1-800-799-SAFE. You can also get additional support from the website for each of these organisations, and all the contact information will be in the description box. Also, I need to mention Clare's Law, which is a way for people to access information from the police if they're concerned that they or a loved one are in a relationship with a domestic abuser. The point of this scheme is to enable people to find out about the history of these men. It's named after a woman called Claire Wood, who, aged just 36, was murdered in February 2009 by her ex-boyfriend, George Appleton, who then killed himself a few days later. Appleton had a history of violently abusing his partners and was known to the police as being an extremely dangerous man. The scheme is officially known as the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme in England and Wales, and in Scotland it's known as the Disclosure Scheme for Domestic Abuse. In Northern Ireland, it's called the Domestic Violence and Abuse Disclosure Scheme. For each force area, they have a form you can fill out on their website. So, for example, if you type in Clare's Law Essex Police, you get taken to this website. You then add your postcode to make sure you're communicating with the right force, and then you're given options of how you want to gain a disclosure, either online or in person. most forces will look to give you information within 28 days. My personal preference would be to go into a police station and ask them about the scheme. Then you can fill in the forms in a place of safety. You won't be handed a huge file. The scheme doesn't allow you to get all information. It's about proportionality. Someone will determine what they think you need to know. I know that doesn't sound great, but if there's information to suggest that you or someone else is in danger, you will be told. Damien Bendall pleaded guilty to these offences eventually, and so there was no trial. He was simply sentenced, so no explanation was given in court as to why he committed these offences. However, from looking at this case, I think I have quite a good idea of why he did what he did. But in order to understand this, I need to outline the profile of Damien Bendall. But first, I want to point out that the conclusions that I've reached shocked even me, and I think it makes the unimaginable horror in this case even worse. So please end the video now if you need to. Specifically, it's clear that Bendall was a psychopath, a weak, pathetic man, devoid of any emotion, who believed that others should do his bidding and cater to his needs. This included in relationships. He lived rent-free in the house with Terry and the children, and likely felt this was his domain, and despite his behaviour, he was entitled to act in any manner he wanted. As with other domestic abuse perpetrators, defiance of his will or calling him out on his behaviour was met with punishment. I think that Bendall's beliefs about entitlement within the family home included using this environment to indulge his paedophilic sexual interest in children, something the police were already very concerned about. Unfortunately, I think the trigger to this incident was something to do with Lacey. Whether Bendall was caught doing something or something was disclosed, I think that Terry confronted him. Her daring to question him on his behaviour meant she needed to be punished, so he attacked her with the hammer. He then went around attacking the children, so as to not leave any witnesses, leaving no one alive to tell the police what really happened that night, and also so he could spin his web of lies. He then did something unspeakable. He raped Lacey, and a terrible detail in the reports I've seen is that he deliberately took her into the same room where her mother was lying, either dead or dying, in order to do this. I think that Bendall deliberately raped Lacey in front of her mother, with him hoping that she would hear and see him doing this to her daughter. This would show her that he was in control and that he would do whatever he wanted with her children. He wanted the last thing she saw to be him violating her daughter. This conclusion, if accurate, sickens me, and I think epitomises the evil of Damien Bendall. He is where he belongs, and, as a child rapist and murderer, I do not imagine his time in prison will be easy. This was a very, very heavy case, so please, check your mental health. My videos are distressing, I know that, but please, if you need to take time away from the channel, or not watch any of the videos at all, I totally understand. Your mental health comes first. Please also remember that I talk about the very darkest recesses of humanity. The world is not full of darkness, it is full of light. Remember that. Anyway, please take care, and I'll see you in the next one.